Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. My name is Katie Grulich. I'm the Academic Collaborations and Engagement Coordinator at the Broad Art Museum. We're delighted tonight to welcome Lessie Jo Frazier, who's Associate Professor of American Studies and Gender Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington. She's also Adjunct Associate Professor of History, Anthropology, and Cultural Studies and Affiliate Faculty at IU's Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, Center for Study of Global Change, and programs in Latino Studies and International Studies. Her work focuses on political culture in the Americas, and in particular the intersection of theories of power, subjectivity, ideology, and political economy. She has published on gender, nation-state formation, human rights, mental health policies, memory, poetics, activism, and feminist ethnography. She's the author of Salt in the Sand, Memory, Violence, and the Nation-State in Chile, 1890 to the Present, which was awarded the Louis Hankey Prize by the Conference on Latin American History. And her new book, Desired States, Gender, Sexuality, and Political Culture, is forthcoming from Rutgers University Press in the spring of 2020, so very new, and congratulations. Professor Frazier's teaching includes courses on transnational feminisms, gender, race, and the erotics of imperialism, gender and sexuality in Latin America, theories of gender and sexuality, feminist perspectives on warfare and militarism methodology, and gender and human rights. She holds a PhD in anthropology and history from the University of Michigan, and the talk fit on one line on the last page. Her talk is titled The Edge of Desire, Visual Regimes of Fascism and Dissidence. Please join us in welcoming Lessie Jo.
Okay. Thanks so much, Katie, and much appreciation to all the curators and organizers here at the museum for this opportunity to be with you this evening. Whoops. Sorry. Devices. Okay. Feminist theorists of visual culture have pointed to the edge as a site revealing and at times challenging the politics of the visible. The fascist regimes that this exhibition speaks to challenged or worked not only through erasure, and Jacques Rancière says that the police state is less the officers calling to you, whose authority you recognize, but rather the officer who says, move along, there's nothing to see here. Moreover, fascists work and garner followings through the erotics of their own power, power that also depends on the traffic between the visible and fantasies of the occluded. So here tonight, I want to consider with you questions of desire in the embodied politics of human rights activists' challenges to counter-revolutionary fascist remakings of what could be perceived and what should be politically desired. This talk moves between past and present. And while the exhibit centers dissident art from Chile, Argentina, and Brazil of the 1970s and 80s, our challenge tonight is to both understand the context for its interventions and to parse the relevance of those interventions today. I do so by focusing on Chile mostly, where the repression that is dealt with in the exhibit came last and lasted longest. But I'm happy to address Argentina and Brazil more in the Q&A. Tonight I suggest here a set of conceptual frameworks for thinking about the state, desire, and political culture, before, in the end, coming back around to the question of current contestation and this year's electrifying events. Just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, I started here with a piece of mural art, kind of commemorating a detention center during the dictatorship and demanding recognition of the violence that happened there. This piece is quite a bit different from contemporary conceptual art. Here is a piece by Cristobal Lecht, who was born in 1973, the year of the coup in Chile, and moves between the US, Europe, and Chile as an artist. And I just want to show you a piece of his work because in the idea that fascist art occludes the truth and then a dissident art then reveals the truth, Lecht certainly kind of disrupts that. So this is an installation involving logs of wood from Chile soaked in Chilean wine. And to get to the rest of, which I'm not going to show you, to get to the rest of the exhibit, you have to figure out how to get through this kind of barricade. So the whole point is to make getting to whatever is behind there difficult. I want to contrast that kind of conceptual art with things that are usually thought of as artisan work. And I do this through the work of an artist who is a very close friend of mine and her project that I'm going to tell you about next. Again, this is, like Lecht's work, a contemporary piece. Heart, fruit, and vulva, densely, delicately embroidered in red, purple, green, blue, and peach thread on white cloth. The stem evokes connectedness, the leaves transformative energy, the concentric curves of open fruit, wombs and ripe passion, food, sex, emotion, vital nutrients, sensuous work. The artist, Patricia Ruiz Delgado, worked dozens of such hearts. Each embroidered heart of the 16 in her traveling exhibit, Corazones, Hearts, corresponds to the photograph of a smiling woman whose life was ended by murder, a fact noted succinctly at the end of the unique poetic passage posted just below her photo, along with a poem mounted on burlap that decries the crime and demands the right to a passion-filled life. Ni una menos y nada menos. On exhibit at the Chilean National Archives in 2017, sponsored by the Women's History Archival Department, the hearts called from within and without for the state to be held accountable, not one woman less, their replete design suggesting that nothing less will do. In that moment, in that space, the artist interpolated the state not only in its more or less accepted mandate to ensure the basic conditions of life, but also for the conditions of possibility for multivalently desiring subjects. An apt instance for me of political desire as a robustly expansive category. In this case, the method, aesthetic, and substance of feminist emancipatory projects. But there is more. This desire is embedded in dense social relations that give it valence. Growing up in a working class neighborhood in the national capital, Santiago, during the military dictatorship that lasted nearly 2 decades, Pati's inquisitiveness led her to seek out the flourishing feminist non-governmental organizations that offered workshops on everything from political theory to the arts to practical and hopefully remunerative skills. It is perhaps fitting that the publication of my new book next spring will coincide with the 30th anniversary of my first wintry visit to Chile when I met her, where in a tented stall in the Artisans' Fair, where she sold leather goods with a smooth camel finish, onto which she painted tiny folk images and scenes. So there we discussed heady topics in the wake of the first Gulf War, feminism, poetry, and human rights. Patti supported her brother's activism in Mobile, a prominent Chilean gay rights organization of the era. A couple of years later, she enrolled in a feminist project to train women to enter the fisheries industry, a field in which she successfully worked for a while until her commitments drew her into the grassroots work of transnational women's non-governmental organizations. Over time, she came to embrace the category lesbian as it emerged in that context as one that affirms her creativity and commitments. In recent years, she has deepened her creative labors, culminating in the Corazones project. As much as her artwork, her biographical trajectory parallels my concerns, a questioning of boundaries between the intimate and the political, ideology and affect, and between needs and desires. Could it be that political projects themselves, not to mention political actors, are erotically charged in ways that intersect with and at times shape the desires, sexual practices, and very parameters of their constituencies? How do people connect with and become mobilized in political projects? And how do they become disaffected or excluded? How do spaces for alternate orientations emerge? I look to Chile to examine these questions. Why Chile, you might ask? It is a place long seen on the world stage as a laboratory and example for political ideologies and economic models. The country was seen as the neoliberal darling, the Chilean miracle. The experimentation that is Chile, a place often seen as a remote laboratory for 20th century and now 21st century political ideologies, and for ostensibly post-ideological market innovations, entailed reshaping the contours of an otherwise remarkably constant and stable state. The country has served, in the words of political analysts, as the undisputed role model for Latin America and the global South, as it was conceived in the past decades by global bodies such as the World Bank, the UN, or the International Monetary Fund, and consequently by the nation itself. Chile's story, as told through these observers, is that of a political culture with dramatic expansions and contraction in the forms and scales of mobilization and participation that has at turns drawn on, contained, and quashed alternative dimensions of political affinity. It is also the first country in the Americas to elect a woman president in her own right, who I'll be mentioning several times this evening. This is Michelle Bachelet, and then re-elect her for a non-consecutive second term. In between, she founded the UN Office for Women and is now Secretary General of Human Rights for the United Nations. So an interesting figure in her own right. Chile has a rich history of workers' organizations, as well as cross-class projects successfully attaining state power and governance. Chile's vibrant political culture offers a useful window into the production of desire, especially given its current curious status as simultaneously geopolitically exemplary and marginal. Moreover, Latin America is an interesting context from which to consider political cultures, since scholarship on state formation in this region has been particularly strong, as have efforts to engage with post-colonial theories of political subjectivity. It has been known for its vibrant multi-party political system, the importance of gender within that system, the prominence of religion in political life, a widespread and long-standing love of poetry and theater, and its ongoing struggles around fascist tendencies that manifest in alliances between military states and imperialist oligarchic capital. And these have butted up against strong populist and leftist social movements, a recipe for conflict, to say the least. Anthropologist Begoña Arrechaga posits the state as a screen for political desires and identifications as well as fears, and urges scholars to find out how the state becomes a social subject in everyday life by examining the subjective experience of state power and tracing its effect on territories, populations, and bodies, to consider the ways in which violence, sexuality, and desire work in the intimate spaces of state power. My use of the term affect follows Sarah Ahmed's critique of that line of theory that reserves the term for pre- or supra-discursive models, as Foucault in his use of the idea of pleasure, distinguished from emotion as fully discursive, as desire is for Foucault. Ahmed charges that this bifurcation reinstates mind-body dualisms, and instead she asserts affect as an ample phenomenological category spanning emotions, articulated as such, and other embodied dispositions. Because the way that affect and ideology cross spaces and bodies often seem disparate, foregrounding gender and sexuality allows us to see how political projects necessarily entail the shaping and living of affective modes. Desire moves across ideology, culture, representation, and practices. Need, gratification, and demand direct affect at the intersection of both explicit ideologies and unarticulated spaces and practices in the formation of political subjects. This formation delimits what should be desired, what is open for contestation, and what it means to be ethically and materially committed to a project. Former Chilean President Michelle Bachelet understood this when, in her second term, she audaciously announced policies that can change cultures. Changing political culture is an ambitious project, to say the least. Among other challenges, the ongoing behind-the-scenes power of the Freemasons and the radical right-wing Catholic secret society, Opus Dei, contrast astonishingly with Chile's multi-party political culture. Political commentators have noted, whether the nation succeeds in its attempted post-neoliberal transition or not, Chile will remain what Harvard's Ned Strong calls one of the most enigmatic nations of the hemisphere. It can be cast as enigmatic in part because of this particularly intrinsic connection between nation and state. This is a post-colonial state, and in a seemingly mysterious fashion, it took on the semblance of having a stable, coherent, and enduring state subjectivity of its own. Thusly animating the state has obscured the ways in which the state expresses relations of atomized individuals to society as a whole, in Bertel Oman's gloss on Marx. It follows that politics is an enactment of these social relations. Oman continues, whenever people relate to one another as members of the general community, that is, as citizens, no matter what they do or want, they can be said to be engaging in politics. This ample definition helps me conceptualize political culture as that which signals those practices and relationships as ones imbued with particular meanings. In this case, as the predominant point of orientation, the Chilean state has been the ostensible object of desire in all political and even the rhetorically apolitical contestations. This play of gender and sexual politics in Chilean political culture has been regarded as a special characteristic. One of the most Catholic countries in the world, Chile only recently legalized divorce and abortion in limited cases. Abortion which was legal until the dictatorship left power and was used as a tool to make democratic rule more difficult. Political scientists benefited from Chile's decade-long insistence on having men and women vote in separate ballot boxes, and it is the first country in the Americas to elect a female head of state running on her own merit rather than through kinship to a male politician. And she was intent on achieving gender equity within the state from top to bottom. Sociologist Jyoti Puri has argued that the regulation of sexuality constitutes an ideal arena through which states enact themselves as such, and hence her concept, sexual states. If so, then the relative solidity and stability of the Chilean nation-state may directly correlate to its tenacious, severe disciplining of sexuality and enforcement of propriety across political regimes. In modeling the sexual state, Puri has less to say, however, on how the politics of desire and the pleasure of doing politics are imbricated in political cultures, especially when topics of physical expressions of sexuality, who has what kind of sex with what consequences, are not explicitly on the table of debate and dissent. Chile, as a so-called laboratory of modern ideologies, thus offers a quintessential location for thinking about politics and passion. My interest then responds to the lure of this most enigmatic of spaces. Political actors' desire for the state meant that the control of the central state came to constitute their primary political objective by the middle of the 20th century, crafted and sustained by political parties that attempted to subsume multiple vectors of conflict and allegiance, including race, ethnicity, class, and gender, under the rubric of contention among parties and under the rubric of nationalism. Because the state is alienated social power or illusory community, then politics is not just a sector of capitalist life, but rather an expression of capitalist existence, to quote Bertel Oman again. As such, political parties' attempted appropriation of broader contestatory worlds was never entirely successful. In the 20th century, semi-autonomous working class civic and labor organizations flourished, but ultimately capitulated both to populism and became domesticated within a centralizing multi-party system. That party system and the civil society with which it had become inextricably intertwined were decimated in the 1973 military coup that brought General Pinochet and the military junta to power. The pro-coup politicians and military officers had been goaded infamously by highly mobilized right-wing women whose challenges explicitly linked the political securing of masculine virility to violent action. What followed the military coup entailed the systematic decimation of the left leadership at every level, combined with the randomized violence of state terror, in the wake of which social movements, largely led by women, took up the struggle for democracy, linking anti-authoritarianism at home and in the streets. The transition to civilian rule in the 1990s saw the rebirth of party dominance and their appropriation of the vitality of these same social movements. Anthropologist Gail Rubin notes that while sex is always in some dimension political, there are also historical periods in which sexuality is more sharply contested and more overtly politicized. The national popular projects of the 1940s Popular Front and the 1970 to 73 Popular Unity government faced periodic fascist onslaughts. repression designed to take apart individual and collective selves and recreate them in a fascist form. This too often works in gendered and sexual dimensions. And in the scholarship and journalism on the dirty wars, as they came to be called in South America, has long substantiated such conclusions. Less understood, beyond considerations of continental European fascism, have been the ways in which repressive states must generate fields of desire around the state itself. The more perverse intersections of states and desires can be found in the erotics of the militarized repressive state. The dynamics and legacies of such perversities and the ways in which structured political desires can be undone unintentionally in one moment or left to fester in a misdirected politics of reconciliation in another fascinate me. The state is not just a rational policy-generating apparatus, but rather is embedded and invested in shaping wider cultural desires directed toward itself and other entities in the polity. This is true under fascism as much as it's true under populist governments. The state's need to sustain the interests of contending, desirous political elements has manifested in multiple forms of relation to contestatory projects, including explicitly feminist ones. Feminists of various sorts have insisted on politics that expose and challenge the boundaries between production and reproduction, and have intertwined patriarchal logics of political economy and domestic domination, denouncing the twisted desires of fascist militarism. So, how do we think about art, affect, and political violence? In many ways, the pieces in this exhibit, which, have you seen this? Anybody not seen the exhibit? Oh, this is great. This is great. All emerge in the aftermath of the kind of political contestations that are very familiar to people who know US history in terms of the 60s, right? And we might ask, why were these movements considered so threatening that they were quashed violently by various states, of which Chile, Argentina, and Brazil are paradigmatic in their overwhelming use of state force? Might it be that elites, especially those at the heart of capitalist empire, saw in these movements their own slipping grasp on imperial social orders, a social order tenuously secured through the sexual discipline of socioeconomic stratifications that were racialized, often locally and always globally? 60s movements emerged at a moment when eugenics, the earlier frame through which sex, gender, and race were made central to governance, was no longer the de facto mode by which politics, now defined as nation states, sought progress and modernity. Taking its place was modernization theory, under which the explicit racial limitation imposed on non-white nations, or semi-white nations, ostensibly was gone. Modernization paradigms firmly established by the 1960s emphasized the building of technical capacities, centrally through the expansion of education systems. Yet the same expansion that these paradigms called for brought into close proximity people whose class and race would have previously walled them off from each other. And many students of this era aligned themselves to peasant and worker struggles. Thus, much of the repression in the Southern Cone that is protested in this dissident art is in fact a repression directed against people under 30, to paraphrase another famous 60s framework. Those that don't trust anybody over 30, right? So, and from the point of view of elites, these were unholy and threatening alliances. Elites anticipated losing their ability to maintain social order through sexual discipline of previous socioeconomic stratifications. And imperial political elites were forced to grapple simultaneously with racial conflict, immigration, decolonial demands, women's rights, decriminalization of homosexuality, and militant social movements, all in the same day, often. That is the violent and frequently lethal responses by states around the world were a reaction to the recognized conundrum that the very expansion deemed vital for modernization's progress also weakened the previous global hierarchy of social order by increasing the visibility of interracial and interclass mixing. In examining the actions or rhetoric of both elites and youth, understanding these movements and state responses requires a larger context, one troubling and working the parameters of national, transnational, global, and imperial histories to reveal the linkages between modernization and the racialized erotics of those 60 sociocultural movements, and the concomitant focus on the repression of the sexualized and eroticized repression of bodies by the militaries in the aftermath. Attentive to debates at the time and the historiography about fascist and leftist international revolutionary aesthetics, I argue that visual evidence of violence in relation to young bodies ostensibly represented the future and the mobilization of those bodies to challenge the social and political system, which rattled elite commitments to the political and social expansion required by modernization in capitalist empire. Rebellions were imagined in relation to the provocations of movements. Provocations that political elites cast as violent global threats, requiring in turn police, state violence, and containment. The invocation of violence by both the movements and political elites as an eroticized practice exposed the ongoing racial order of capitalist empire and the ways disparate movements challenged it. The strength of movements for redistribution of resources and access to political power saw themselves as part of world-making anti-imperialism that challenged Cold War obligatory alliances to one superpower or the other. These movements threatened the dominant power structures. More destabilizing still, the state turned its repressive apparatus against its own children, students under 30, as well as, and young people in general, as well as against more subordinate sectors. The violence against young people was coeval and magnified in relation to the performative insurgent actions by movements and the state repression of non-elite racialized sectors at home and abroad. This state reaction not only generated questions about the existence of a repressive apparatus, it shined light on the very architecture of the larger national imperial capitalist projects itself, on behalf of which the state was understood to act in any given context. This required on a kind of racialized erotics of the police, acting ostensibly to secure an order, that is, the maintenance of globalized hierarchies. The police remained figured in nationalizing reproductivist terms that foregrounded the mother and child, representing the nation as the objects of protection. Militarized police forces were themselves the objects of fascist desire and acted on behalf of and to sustain racialized heteropatriarchal order, even as they usually invoked homoerotic visualities. Images of fascist violence are more than the complementary logical counterpart to those of respectable reproduction to be defended. Rather, these images of eroticized violent encounters between social sectors and against the police state are a window onto elite panics over changes to the social architecture of societies at the time, even as they confirmed and perpetuated the legitimacy of the threat of state reaction. So scholar Nicholas Mirzoff offers a frame for thinking through the centrality of visuality in capitalist empire, the counter of which, according to him, would be what he calls the right to look. That is, the right of subordinate sectors to fashion themselves and to be recognized as political actors. In Mirzoff's historical scheme for what he calls the complexes of visuality, the period from the 60s to 80s, the period discussed in this exhibit, falls into two overlapping periodizations. An imperial complex, wherein fascist visuality is countered by anti-fascist neo-realism's visualization of the South, and a military-industrial complex, wherein aerial visuality, the view from above, with its metonymic figure of the counterinsurgent, is countered by decolonial neo-realism and a planetary visualization, which he dates from the mid-1960s, of a biosphere. In considering fascist imperial visuality and the struggles of subordinate sectors to look back, Mirzoff spends a great deal of time with Frantz Fanon's work toward decolonizing visuality and neorealist cinema, in particular Pontecorvo's Battle of Algiers. However, in his reading, he fails to situate fully this decolonizing film as part of a period in which young artists betrayed capitalist empire in co-producing looking back with decolonizing peoples, so something we can certainly discuss later. Situating this period as a crux of activists and issues around decolonial, anti-imperialist, and anti-authoritarian struggles reveals the crossings of lines of allegiance that made states consider movements as deserving of violent repression. Visuality and looking back are less useful as a binary with implied privileged subjects, and more useful as a scale along which dialectical processes of power and pushback to power constitute political possibilities. In this push-pull, neorealism played alongside decidedly non-realist and ludic renditions and territorial performances of defiance. So this is my critique of Mirzoeff, that Mirzoeff's argument based solely on ideology requires that the counter-visuality be one of increasing revelation, right? Increasing visuality. And that just doesn't really jive with many of the works that we've seen here that are themselves interested in the relation of what's seen and not seen, in the edges, to kind of build on the title of the exhibit. Instead, the maleness of the warlike space pervaded the coverage, even as activists were not depicted as aggressors, but as an answering the police advance. Still, there was an erotics to this coverage as well, an erotics of violence from which you can't avert your eyes. Akin to spectators of a gruesome car accident, blood is shown on activists' faces and bodies. Cops are shown in the act of attack, billy clubs raised, voices shouting. So Mirzoeff contends that the counter to capitalist imperialism's fascist visuality is neorealism, telling a fuller story. Part of the revolutionary nature of neorealist cinema came from its insurgent collective practices of distribution. And I know you guys also watched the Battle of Chile. We had a showing here of that. But this also came from its collective practices of distribution, especially in the context of dictatorship and other regimes of censorship. And interactive viewing, encouraged by the ways in which moments to pause and collectively reflect were structured into the films, such that watching the film was meant to constitute a political event. And this happened on campuses and in union halls across the Americas. The ways in which visual culture can foment civic engagement have been explored richly by feminist scholars. Ariela Azule, she offers us the idea of the civil contract of photography. And she looks at photojournalism of human rights violation and the ways in which images of the everyday forms of violence of human rights violations at the hands of the police demand not only the right to look, in Mirzoeff's term, but also that the viewer look and act. And in one particular image that I think is very powerful in Azule's work, she shows a checkpoint, an Israeli-Palestine checkpoint, and you see barbed wire and a group of men held within the barbed wire. And she says this is an image of rape. And why is it an image of rape? Because of what you don't see. Where are the women? If all the men are contained, who's with the women? What are they made available? What are their bodies made available for? What kinds of violence? And so I think this is an example of the ways in which the ideas of what don't you see in an image and the edges of images would be really important. Similarly, Sean Michelle Smith, in her book entitled The Edge of Sight, builds on Azule's idea, as does Ranjana Khanna in a book called Algeria Cuts, where she's looking at that space between frames of a film, at the edges of the film. They similarly look at what photographic and cinematic images withhold as acts of meaning-making. Yet these only get us part of the way in understanding contemporary art, which is less invested into what information to present and withhold than in how we represent and experience visual edges. And this is where my interest in thinking about desire as both affect and ideology comes into play. And so it's not that we just need to say, oh, Mirzoeff, you just dwell on ideology too much, you old-fashioned fellow, but that it's the interplay between what kinds of narratives affect creates predispositions for, and the interplay between those. So how does this model work in terms of thinking about contemporary art? As I say, Mirzoeff has been criticized for an analysis that only considers ideology and thus flattens the complexities of both politics and visuality. Visual studies scholars have turned instead to post-Marxist renditions of affect theory to emphasize the phenomenological ways embodied experience works. My use of desire offers a way to span this ostensible disjuncture between ideology and affect, because I see embodiment as both about narrative and as sensual experience, and as opening up possibilities for new stories, beliefs, and as alliances. Let me tell you a little bit more about how I think desire works. Before I do that, I want to give you another contemporary art example. This is Romantic Costal's a recent installation in Santiago called A Song for Singing Fossils. And it's in a building that was used, it's in an old kind of palace of a wealthy oligarch that was taken over by the military in 1973 and used for telecommunications surveillance. And so in the basement was where they kept all the equipment to try to monitor people, then they could identify them and pick them up. And so Romantico Salles uses all 3 stories of this massive mansion to pull together their installation, which takes pieces of metalwork inspired by the small tram that ran by the house and ideas about wealth coming from capitalist enclaves in the north, and they do castings of Chilean feathers, seaweed, and then put those castings in this building and through the building. So you walk upstairs to the top, and then as you move down through the building, you're kind of seeing the wires, and this will interest Professor Murphy on electricity, right? The whole notion of like being wired. So there's a mixture between, this is a casting of kind of the plants, the autochthonous plants. There's a mixture between nature and fabrication, and the pieces of the installation that you never get a full picture, you just get more as you move through the building until you get to the basement where the surveillance took place. So here would be an example of a space that you're expected to inhabit, and you're expected to feel feelings of both disaffection and super creepiness. It's super creepy. That's not very academic, but it's super creepy. And so I think this is an example of how you both need some kind of you need some ideological frame in order to understand what they're trying to do with this, because it's very elaborate, all the kinds of metalworking and different symbols and so forth. And but it's also meant to be an embodied experience as so much installation art is, of course. I want to take a few minutes to tell you a little bit more about the ways I think about desire in political culture, but I'm really mindful of the time because I want to have plenty of time for discussion. Are you guys hanging in there? Yeah, okay, good. That's good to know. Feminist scholarship on desire has been haunted by what may seem like a dated debate, a debate over dichotomies of needs versus desires, which have pitted so-called materialism against so-called post-structuralism. However, that debate, which I gloss as needs versus desires, still dogs gender scholarship, despite remarkable consensus around the need to critique and challenge injustice. And there's a very clear overlap between that and also this kind of push and pull between affect and ideology. So I want to talk about a few of the terms that I use to think about desire in political culture, such as libidinal economies, the erotics of democracy, the rigidity of the sex-gender grammar, and cultural intelligibilities. While psychoanalytic cultural theory has given gender scholars a rich vocabulary for talking about desire, my perspective is not a psychoanalytic one per se. For me, libidinal economies range from sexual relations between bodies in close proximity to the erotics of power for the body politic. I take my cue from cultural critic Eve Sedgwick's formulation, using desire to mark the erotic emphasis in critical dialectic that names the structural permutations of social impulses. It is worth quoting her at length here as she explains her use of desire in a way analogous to the psychoanalytic use of libido, not for a particular affective state or emotion, but for the affective or social force, the glue, even when its manifestation is hostility or hatred, or something less emotively charged that shapes an important relationship. I think about libido, which just is Latin for desire, to broadly refer to the energy underlying people's activities in a way that moves beyond modernist dichotomies between mind and body. I further heed Sedgwick's caution how far this force is properly sexual. What historically it has meant for something to be sexual is an active question. Thus, I accentuate what she calls genital sexuality in a wider field of fantasies, ideologies, and practices. The erotics of power permeating that field have been foregrounded analytically by feminist insistence on the contentious intimacy of politics. Much in this vein, classicist Victoria Wohl explores the erotics of democracy in a culturally specific context in which, she says, Eros' domain was broad, encompassing not just love, romantic or otherwise, but also sex and sexuality, gender, desire, and pleasure. Refusing Foucault's tendency to see sexual relations as primarily an instance of power relations, I see power as arousing Eros, but not fully circumscribing it. Politics and sexual desire, then, are inseparable. Love arises, in Wohl's words, from power relations and implicates lovers in power relations. Politics is a form of ideological desire, a desire to be governed by and directed toward ideology. Sexual relations, then, at times are explicitly understood by actors to instantiate political desires, while at other times sexual relations are naturalized as a political terrain. Chilean critic Kimi Oyarzun similarly points to the obdurate rigidity of sexual gender grammars of subjectification. She contends that, in her words, in the midst of society's more and more open and plural sexual mores contracted. The sex-gender system has operated like a caste system at the heart of the supposed mobility of class societies. The sex-gender system never kept up with technological changes in other aspects of modern societies, according to Oyarzun. Something resisted, she says, something associated with prejudice or dogma. To understand how the production of subjects depends on often recalcitrant grammars of gender and sexuality, or cultural intelligibility, as Judith Butler posits, gender is enacted bodily, performed repetitively in ways that generate the materiality of sexual bodies, understood via the framework of what she calls the heterosexual matrix, which triangulates sex, gender, and desire in a kind of feedback loop. Gender is said to flow naturally from sex, and desire, equated with sexuality, ostensibly flows from gender difference. Subjectification is an effect of power working in terms of gender and sexuality. Conversely, gender, sexuality, and desire become key elements of both structural relations and pervasive currents of power. To return to Eve Sedgwick, she underscores that the placement of the boundaries between the sexual and the non-sexual, like the boundaries between gender, is variable, but it's not arbitrary, as these boundaries affect not only those aspects, but moreover, the apportionment of forms of power that are not obviously sexual. These include control over the means of production and reproduction of goods, persons, and meanings. In that apportionment, in what philosopher Nancy Fraser calls the history of boundary struggles between social reproduction and production, this boundary struggle necessitates questioning the distinctions between needs and desires. So if desires are the drives that take over after ostensibly more biological needs have been met for psychoanalytic theorists, for philosophers, the very broadest sense of desire can mean merely a propositional attitude, without discriminating the status of the action or the object, including the satisfaction of basic requirements or needs. So they don't have a problem with distinguishing needs from desires. Similarly, refusing to take the category of need at face value, philosopher Nancy Fraser points to Foucault's lemma: need is a political instrument, meticulously prepared, calculated, and used. That is, need is a discursive field, as is sexuality. And she argues that in late capitalism, discourses about needs have come to play a central role in political debate and are critical to the making and contesting of political claims, and the shifts in the boundaries between political, economic, domestic, or personal spheres of life in late capitalist society. Indeed, the recent conflagration in Chile is about the cost of living, about the satisfaction of needs, which is tied to the satisfaction of political desires around the Constitution. As feminists began to succeed in politicizing previously depoliticized needs and demanding that states respond to them, activists have come up against the contending needs and discourses and state expert interpretation of needs satisfaction. As finance capital has gained preeminence, it has exacted state divestment from social reproduction, commodifying it for some and externalizing care work onto families at precisely the time that fewer are able to assume this burden because women are compelled to enter or remain in the wage labor market. Capitalist accumulation depends on such exploitation, and yet this imperils the fate of the entire system, making social reproduction increasingly difficult to attain. For Fraser, boundary struggles over social reproduction then erupt at the sites of capitalism's constitutive institutional divisions. where economy meets polity, where society meets nature, and where production meets reproduction. Yet this constitutive divisiveness on which capitalism relies extends into the processes of alienation that bifurcate lives in their most intimate instantiation. Capitalism erodes the conditions of its own survival when it strips the social, mutual care in the context of social relations from the realm of social reproduction. In Marx's words, life appears only as a means to life rather than conscious vital activity, or what he calls sensuous labor. Alienation leaves no connection between people and that which they create with their labor, so they cling to the only things over which they seem to have some agency. Marx says, eating, drinking, and procreating, at most indwelling in dress. These are all ways we meaningfully relate to nature. I'll repeat that, eating, drinking, and procreating. Yet even these become merely ends to the perpetuation of capitalism and are stripped of their meaningful elements, such that even in these most basic activities, what he calls human functions, workers feel animal. These truly human functions are abstracted from the other round of human activity, and this makes them into final and exclusive ends. Of these activities, Marx maintains that the quality of sexual relationships can be viewed as a kind of barometer for the possibilities for meaningful life at any juncture. And philosopher Herbert Marcuse, a really important figure for activists of the 60s, so a person who would have been well known and read by the artists in this exhibit, Marcuse reminds us that Freud saw these activities as facets of the same process as libido is part of gratifying the central life need. Sexual drives extend toward gaining more and more intensive and extensive pleasure, toward the generation of libidinous ties, toward the production of a libidinous, that is, happy environment. All meaningful work is originally libidinous and connected to communal labor. Work began because there was pleasure in work, not only after work, pleasure in the play of faculties and the fulfillment of life needs, not as a means of life, but as life itself, according to Marcuse. Marcuse elaborates the procreative piece of these processes, one decisive for the fate of freedom, in his words. He argues that eros is the life instinct. Eros as the life instinct is sexuality, which is deriving pleasure from the body, not localized in specific parts of the body or limited to special functions. Monogamous reproductive priorities reduce the broad category of eros in the processes of desexualization, whereby non-genital erogenous zones are nullified as sex becomes a means to reproductive ends. Sociologist Titi Bhattacharya exhorts us to more fully understand the social relationships of capital in which such bodily acts occur. Doing such this, Alan Sears argues that sexuality under capitalism, like labor, is always in systemic contradiction, in that control over one's body is always combined with a form of compulsion. Workers own their own bodies, yet must sell their capacity for work in order to gain access to the basic requirements for subsistence. Thus, work becomes a means to an end such that workers do not fulfill their human potential or establish bonds of mutuality through the process of work. Human sexuality is social and part of the sensuous activity. It is the work on nature through which we make our mark on the world. And yet, in often making sex a means to an end, heteronormativity naturalizes sexuality and erases the ways humans make deliberate choices that are social and aesthetic. It is a form of sexual regulation tied to alienation and dispossession that reinforces a particular organization of social reproduction at a given moment, even as this changes over time. Sears calls for an understanding of sexual activity that resists abstracting it from the whole matrix of human embodied interactions forged around mutuality. Similarly, José Esteban Muñoz affirms the queer implications of Marcuse's rendition of Eros. He says, queerness is more than just sexuality. It is a great refusal that allows the human to feel and know not only our work and our pleasure, but also ourselves and others. Taken together, these thinkers help bridge the long-standing needs versus desires polemic between Frazier's emphasis on the plight of caregiving, depicted in the most decidedly unerotic terms possible, in the boundary struggle between production and reproduction on the one hand, and on the other, Judith Butler's insistence on the centrality of the body in accumulation and dispossession, and its therefore concomitant erotic power and protest. However, Butler's bodies occupying spaces, she talks about the square, in ways that that intrinsically reveal the workings of power are bodies divorced from articulated political projects, and certainly from the albeit often inchoate political dreams. Once again, we're back to the problem of the relationship between affect and ideology. Further delineating the ramification of conceptual antagonism between Butler and Frazier, Kemi Oyarzun posits, the new generation of Chilean feminisms face two grand challenges. On the one hand, to make way for the articulation of social rights, equality, and democracy, at the same time fighting for and within differences of class, race, and gender. In this sense, Chile's failed national project since the dictatorship challenges us to make way for the politics of representation after 17 years of interrupted democracy. Oyarzun continues, simultaneously here in Chile, possibilities have opened up that Frazier signaled as procedural historical paths for feminist movements, which she enumerates as struggles for representation and suffrage, struggles for identities, and struggles for the redistribution of power and riches as much as material and symbolic wealth. For me, Oyarzun's insights suggest that authoritarian states imposed themselves for 2 decades as the only permissible site of political desire. Thus, even though the 20th century history of Chilean feminism may have been unfolding according to Frazier's logic, the lived expression of that history in political life had been eradicated such that 21st century feminists are engaged in simultaneous battles of representation, participation, and redistribution. Multiple fronts entail multiple sites of desire. We might think about this kind of desire drawing on long traditions of socialist thought in Latin America, influenced transnationally. So for many Chileans in the early part of the 20th century, Alexandra Kollontai, who was also a diplomat in Mexico and was really read across Latin America, her idea of red love as sexual and camaraderie solidarity really resonated. Compare red love, uniting labor and desire, to Frazier's rather grim depiction of the struggle, and to Butler, who, in insisting quite abstractly that bodies perforce challenge capitalist regimes when they occupy particular spaces, Butler elides the affective importance of political projects, dreams, utopic fantasies, and erotic praxis. Most expansively, Bradley MacDonald asserts, with the help of Marx, desire may be defined as the continual sensuous striving beyond one's facticity, a striving embedded within its own embodied historicity and not necessarily tied to issues relating to production or labor per se, while pleasure is the affective signification of that striving. I think an interesting formulation. At the nexus of the material and the affective, desire is critical to the boundary struggles between shifting regimes of reproduction and production. The contestatory political projects that inspired the people to dive into the breach of those boundary struggles, sometimes even precipitating them, were affectively embodied, perforce, as people debated, rallied, organized, campaigned, wrote, acted, sang, and yes, loved. I want to talk a little bit about coming back to Chile and the kind of contemporary parameters of struggles today as a legacy of the kinds of contestations that we saw before. So President Michelle Bachelet endured during her first term sort of relentless sexual gossip. And this diminished exponentially by the time she returned for her second term, even as her leadership and policies opened a floodgate of activism around gender and sexual issues. And her own leadership faced challenges from young women of the left, rock star quality student leaders turned congresswomen, a feminist Me Too movement rooted in universities, including slut walks, more radically pro-abortion activists who made television commercials and do-it-yourself abortifacient hotlines. If the sex-gender matrix of political culture is far more complex and deeply entrenched than questions of political style, which she called changing cultures, sexual comportment, or even policy priorities, then it now faces an all and out feminist rebellion. So by the mid-1990s, feminists in Chile had taken tools garnered from recent electrifying visits by theorist Rita Segato from Argentina and the US's own Judith Butler, and used them as fuel for ongoing struggles around education and gendered violence, struggles in which they in turn were building on militant student movements of the last decade. Rita Segato pointed to the ways in which violence is constitutive of patriarchy, a war on women. And Butler notes that we seem to be, this is when they went to Chile to talk. Butler noted that we seem to be in all too familiar situation. She says, we are confronted by the challenges taken up by socialist feminisms a few decades ago, ones that continue to be important to those who are thinking about the economy of the household, the reproduction of labor, and the differential production of illiteracy and poverty. It is perhaps not surprising that this generation of feminists, at least in the Americas, has responded with a retro-separatism that passionately calls out misogynists and demands their downfall, and celebrates women's mobilized solidarity as epitomized in lesbian love. In this tumultuous context, I accompanied our artist, Patricia Ruiz, to a talk she gave at one of the universities that at that moment was not on strike. This is last June, July. She began discussing the origins of her activism in her family's working class, deeply Catholic neighborhood in Santiago. And as a young woman in the 1980s, she participated in Christian communities formed in liberation theology's conviction that collective spiritual work could be a force for positive social change. And then she participated in a very important movement against torture in Chile under the dictatorship called the Sebastián Acevedo Movement Against Torture, which was based on the activism of Catholic clergy and both Catholic and non-Catholic lay people. The movement took on the name of a father who immolated himself as a way of demanding the return of his 2 children taken captive by the state secret police. And so here's the very bizarre newspaper announcement of his immolation, along with essentially pornography. Through nonviolent confrontation with the state, repressive apparatus, and the general population, movement activists worked through lightning protests and through personal appeal to security personnel. If one person was taken by the police, all would demand to be taken into custody as well. The movement worked from the premise that all lived in a society permeated by state violence, and that the solution was one of what they called fraternal correction. So this is very important in terms of not talking about a few bad apples, a few violent soldiers, and calling them out, but rather that the point was to try to deal with an intrinsically social problem. And in this talk to university feminists, Patti linked this formation to her current work confronting violence against women. And I think this constitutes a radical intervention into the politics of our time. So essentially she was juxtaposing this movement against torture, which was pacifist, with subsequent movements that were known as FUNA movements in Chile. And this is where they would go and they would identify a torturer's workplace or house and essentially out them. And this, and what she was doing that was so subversive is she was connecting this problem of how do we deal with violence and fascist violence in society to what was happening with the Me Too movement of essentially using a FUNA kind of process to deal with perpetrators. And this is from this says, patriarchy doesn't scare us anymore, right? And so down with patriarchy. So how do we think about the relationship of state violence and fascist desires to contestatory projects? And to remind you, in her exhibit, of the 16 murdered women, and all were murdered in 2016, the one that resonated most with her audience that day at the university was she dedicated to a young woman named Nicole Saavedra. And she was sexually tortured and murdered and had self-presented as a butch lesbian. And in Chile, as in other places, there's a culturally available notion that straight men may correct forcefully such women. And this year was the 3rd anniversary of her unsolved murder. And feminists from around the country were gearing up for protests in her name, which happened over a series of a week across the country, including occupations of government prosecutors' offices, and marches denouncing hatred against lesbians, lesbiodio. The protest indicted multiple actors systemically who had mishandled the investigation and its implication. Likewise, Patti in her talk emphasized that patriarchy is systemic, and that is not about identifying individual perpetrators, but rather in challenging all kinds of relationships and behaviors, as well as the cultural and institutional frameworks that make the violence possible and intelligible. and her linking of state violence and quotidian violence that comes from the Chilean feminist movements during the dictatorship should prompt questioning of strategies that encourage anonymous social media outing of men identified as aggressors. Should we indulge in the pleasures of vigilante justice? She asked. And admittedly, this is tempting at times, given the sheer audacity of what in Texas we call the old boys. For example, also in 2016, the year of the murders that Pati's artwork commemorates, the Chilean Exporters Association very publicly presented Bachelet's Minister of Economy with a gag gift, an inflated female blonde, very pink sex doll. And over her mouth, they taped a message, "Stimulate the economy." Published photos showed the two men laughing on the stage as they held up the prize. Another suited older businessman stood laughing, stage left. And stage right, which you don't see so well in this picture, is a smiling, applauding young blonde woman in a nearly sheer, tight, white sleeveless jumpsuit. There is an eye candy, what is called there a promoter. While media reporting on the incident included Bachelet's subsequent stern admonishments that this was just not tolerable, the visual evidence in the photos documented the insidiously entrenched sexual prerogatives of Chilean businessmen. Indeed, what possibility is there for remaking the sex-gender matrix of political culture in a society defined for so long by sexual hypocrisy, lack of divorce but lots of annulments, drive-in assignation motels, underground queer dance halls frequented by military officers during the dictatorship and after, where male-dominated secret societies such as Freemasons and Opus Dei govern through behind-closed-doors pacts. In Chile, myself and other scholars find deep, resilient sexism, racism, and classism in an entrenched caste system. And to leave you with a little bit of less grim thoughts, to think about desired states in more liberatory ways, we should perhaps consider Pedro Lemebel's concept of loco afán. And those of you who saw the exhibit will be familiar with Lemebel as part of the Mayors of the Apocalypse performance art. And this is a piece that is also a part of the exhibit up here that is about the conquest of the Americas. So it's a hemispheric kind of reading of long histories of violence and I think fascist desires. So loco afán is often translated as mad desire, a term which works well admittedly for titles. However, Lemebel's concept is strikingly less hyperbolic and much more quotidian, more along the lines of a crazy predilection. And this crazy predilection is much like a theorist we began with, Sarah Ahmed's queer orientation, attraction pulling out of one just out of, though still in relation to, the straight and narrow. Indeed, Lemebel's trans predilection runs across, alongside, and through rather than apart. His ludic transgender practices insist upon the centrality of these odd predilections for understanding power relations as constituted by ambivalent desires, not just those of persons living out non-normative gender and sexuality, but also for those imbued with the privileges of normative personhood. That is, the craziness of the very racialized patriarchal heteronormativity, which decolonial transfeminism argues constitutes our colonial reality, the coloniality of our reality. The decolonial gesture to which Lemebel so fruitfully infuses the concept of mad desire is the chronica, or short quotidian documentation of often ludicrous events and sociocultural tendencies. And so it's that mixture of the everyday and the extraordinary. And then I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here so we have some time for question and answer, because there's lots more I could say about this and about the ways in which Lemebel and dissidents inspired by him have called for the state to be accountable for sexualized violence as a way of thinking about the addressing of needs and communities and relationally. Okay. These activists, along with movements and organizations to which they belong, offer a counterfiguring of capitalist coloniality, where the queer trans chronica challenges the representational dominance of narrative by using a lens to document the contradictions of desire in a state of capitalist imperialism's dispossessions. In short, mad desire suggests to me a way of thinking about political desire or desired states that refuses dichotomies of ludic and materialist, of needs and desires, of affect and ideology. Chilean activists continue to wrestle with their own conflicts and contradictions and to foreground anti-imperial pleasures of associative life in pursuit of eros. The mobilizations of students, feminists, indigenous rights activists, and environmentalists over the past half-decade culminated 3 weeks ago in a general strike. Not only a paralyzation of every aspect of life, but also, as Mirzoff helpfully notes, general strikes visualize the contemporary by creating a general image of the social, not simply a work stoppage, but the right to look, to see and be seen by each other within a historical moment, and to know how things stood. In Chile right now, the visual spaces of the internet work symbiotically with Butler Square, where people gather to protest, chanting, singing, making art, holding town meetings to imagine a new constitution. And they have been met with horrific violence. Horrific not only because it harkens back to the fascism of the military dictatorships, so some images from the last 3 weeks. Not only because they harken back to the fascism of the dictatorships, but in many ways because they amplify that. And sexual assault and images of women in the hands of police is central to its working. Visuality is not just the right to look, but the capacity to see it all. Over 10% of those hospitalized from police brutality right now in Chile suffer ocular wounds so terrible that the Chilean Association of Ophthalmologists released a statement saying that the hospitals were just not equipped to handle the scale of these kinds of wounds. So the state, as if tear gas weren't terrible enough as a way of controlling the right to look back, are removing people's eyes. The police are shooting, I would argue purposefully, non-lethal projectiles into people's eyes. So these are wounds from which they, by and large, survive blinded. This is a form of dealing with mass protest that is not common, and Chile now stands in dubious distinction of coming second only to Israel in these sorts of civilian injuries. So I'm going to just zoom through some of these images that hopefully many of you have seen and we can come back to. So images of people visible to each other, images of what they retrospectively saw as artwork on the police, claims of continuity. This is the legacies of the dictatorship, and immediately pointing to the role of sexual violence, women mobilized as such, feminists mobilized, historically feminized forms of protest, the banging of pots in Chilean political history, and then the use of artworks that are very quickly disseminated. So here are those same pots, subsumed in violence. You also saw the use of red shoes in the original exhibit that I showed. So this is one of the president's ministers. So the president, like many fascist leaders, surrounds himself by an army of women to prop him up his masculinity. And they have been these women have said either horrific things, like the ones in Congress, or have just gone silent. And this is calling them on that. Artworks that draw on forms of denunciation. So this is I don't know how they made this fast. This is an arpillera that says the slogans of the movement. This is not a guerra. This is not a war. And Chile woke. And calling on the president to renounce, calling for a constitutional assembly. And here, this is an organization that they sort of do collective mega arpilleras on the streets. So they call people to come to those. So in this talk, and this I promise is the conclusion, I've looked at the relationship of affect and ideology to question our understandings of what the politics of those boundaries between visibility and invisibility are in protest, in craft, and in things that see themselves as conceptual art. Using concepts of desired state, crazy love, red love, and sensuous labors. And the image I've chosen for this talk's motif, a needlework piece, may seem a retrograde metaphor for the affective and aesthetically pleasurable dimensions of crossing gendered and sexualized boundaries between the intimate and political. Look again. In Patricia Ruiz Delgado's handiwork, we see an insistence on sexually replete, pleasureful bodies, whose repletion will not be obscured by what the artist deems patriarchal violence that is systemic, that is political. Patti situates her sensuous work intersubjectively, communally. She says, the stitches of my artwork were guided by all the women, the arpilleristas, the weavers of the human rights tapestries, the luchadoras, the militants of the 1980s, the leaders of the communal soup kitchens, the women of Temuco, of Chile, indexing indigenous peoples, the poets, the political prisoners, the exiles, my grandmothers, and of course my mother, and all of us in Latin America who embroider the history, our sorrows, our joys. For this artist, needlework then is social, sensuous, practical, critical activity, the praxis of social production and reproduction. Such merging of theory and practice, sensuous human activity marks terms revolutionary. It is a revolutionary intervention into the capitalist boundary struggles between production and reproduction because it insists on challenging the ideological divide between artist and artist, everyday domestic drudgery, and transcendent political fulfillment that undergirds capitalist alienation, what theorist Christian Ross calls, after the Paris communards, communal luxury. Patti Ruiz locates her luxurious work hemispherically in Latin America, with particular visual inspiration from the painted tinwork hearts of Mexican folk art. Her reworking of these colored hearts into embroidery pays homage to Chilean artist Violeta Parra and the human rights embroidery produced in denunciation of the dictatorship, the arpilleras, on displays somewhere out there. I saw it, it was lovely. The use of quotidian photographic portraits echoes the practices of human rights movements, as does the insistence on poetry that denounces violence and celebrates eros. The dedication above that I just read for you insists on the continuum of violence and emancipatory struggle, especially for the working classes, between terrains and subjects defined by dichotomies of public and private, rendered in one form or another, political and personal, state violence and intrafamilial violence, quotidian and historically transcendent. These hearts are crazy desire, crazy predilections. These hearts are red love. Inspired by this visually erotic work, my own work foregrounds sexuality, gender, the erotic, and libidinal drives to posit that political projects necessitate desire, affective links at times explicitly sexualized and most often erotically charged, and that erotics depends on the edges of what we see and what we don't see. Sex and gender are key to lenses onto the practices through which this critical link between desire and political culture operates. Thank you.
Where the women said that it was an example of rape because of the things you cannot see. Could you please elaborate on that? I thought that was a little confusing. And what do you mean by that?
Okay, so this is Ariela Azule, and she's talking about what she calls the civil contract of photography, talking about photojournalism that documents human rights atrocities. And so she's looking at a checkpoint where people are not allowed to pass between territories. And she's saying that though the photojournalists, what they've captured is an image of men being held in behind a fencing, that she argues that she wants us to see the image as one of rape, because she asks us to think beyond the frame, beyond the edges of the picture, into what is the logical consequence of keeping the men separated from the women, of sexual segregation. And her argument is that it makes women's bodies available for assault. And so I gave it as, for me, a very useful way of thinking about the edge of images, what's not shown. And she argues that it's a call to action, that seeing that picture requires something of us as viewers. Does that help a little bit? Yeah.
Thanks, Lessie. I have two questions. First, I'm wondering just kind of a little bit if you could expand on what you were talking about in terms of how the Chilean dictatorship, but also more broadly the regimes that we're talking about here, in their reaction to all kinds of outpourings of the 50s and 60s. I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit on what you think the key threats are, kind of that they are focusing in on, and then in what ways they can, through their displays of power, overcome those threats. I mean, one of the things about, I mean, it's hard to read desire, I think, in these regimes sometimes because of the fact that we think of them in these very sort of like, everything was painted over. Everything became sort of gray. Still, there were spectacular displays of military might, and there is an aesthetic in painting over everything. But it still is a very kind of, it's something that just counterintuitively speaks of kind of desire itself. So I'm wondering if you could just kind of weave out a little bit more what you feel or what you think these regimes are broadly reacting to, and then how and in what ways they're creating a kind of, to some degree, a visual performance that counters that which they're seeking to overcome.
Yeah, that's a really complex question and a very interesting commentary on its own terms.
Well, your talk inspired that. So,
I think about like U.S. scholar Ben Cowan's work on the Brazilian military dictatorship, which he talks about their obsession with sexuality and with policing sexuality. So what kinds of images are appropriate or not. And if I refer you back to that image of Sebastián Acevedo burning himself as a protest of his sons having been taken prisoner next to pornography on a daily newspaper, right? So the kind of sense, and we have other scholars like Dagmar Herzog, who works on German history, has talked about kind of the misrecognition of actually 60s activists that fascism was about the repression of desire, rather than, in fact, they were eugenicists. They wanted the right people to make babies like crazy, and pronatalists because they were at war, right, and projecting long-term war. And so she really challenges us to not automatically accept the equation of certain ideologies with certain kinds of sexual politics. And so those scholars have been really helpful for me to think about this. And I think what we can see is, and what Mirzoff points us to in terms of fascist visuality, and other scholars like Federico Finkelstein talking about, comparatively about our, his word, Patrick, about Italy and Argentina, is the ways in which the idea of the charismatic leader who's embodying the nation kind of comes to subsume, becomes the locus of. I mean, that's what charisma is, right? It's a form of like, you should admire this person, you should want them and want to be them. And so, and this kind of pointing to, don't look here, you focus here. You focus on the verticalist, corporativist state, right? So it's a kind of an orientation of, in phenomenological terms, of where people should put their energies. And certainly you saw we think about Argentina under Perón. I mean, it was all about the kind of an excess of investment in the state and in ideas about charismatic leaders of the state. But I think that there's other ways that we can think about what does the visuality of dictatorships look like. And so I wanted to show you one of like the kind of aerial views, that kind of panoramic view, which Mirzoff associates with imperialism. Which he starts off talking about kind of plantation mode imperialism, which was about seeing your estate, right? Seeing the land, the scope of the landscape. And he sees that as kind of combined with then these other forms of image which direct our gaze just to the police, the body of the police, and a certain kind of body beautiful, right? That George Mossy talked a lot about in terms of Nazi Germany. So it's rather than thinking about it as anti-sexuality or anti-desire, it's a particular way of channeling that affect, the political affect, which is what made those states so powerful, because it was essentially effective. And I think what I wanted to point to as I quickly zoom through the images of Chile today is that I think what we're seeing is a performance of the military for the lens, so that they are in fact producing these images vis-a-vis activists and women's bodies, and that that part of the trouble is that the visual repertoires are intermixed. They're not just, so you see a lot of images of the mass of the million people marching and filling the capital city, right? So you see in many of those same visual repertoires, and like the taking of the statue, right, which you guys are also familiar with from the exhibit. So you could see like a remaking of that, including the feminist movements unfurling, right, banners. And so I think there's an indexing of those images from the dictatorship, but now it's in a very performative way for social media and for the general strike in terms of people perceiving each other as a collective, but also in these kinds of somewhat disturbing ways. And I think that it's so much instantiated in the ocular trauma to people, that it's about states, it's about creating what I've also called in other things, building on Michael Taussig, a space of death, right? To remake the collective, not just the eradication, but the remaking of that, what Rancière and Mirzoff would talk about, the what's visible and not visible, and a renegotiating of that. And so it not only indexes that violence, but it kind of amplifies those prior forms of violence. So everybody is supposed to understand that this tanks in the street, it's supposed to remind you. Now, for many of the people, it doesn't remind them, because they only have what Marion Hirsch calls post-memory, right? They only have the reproduced images of the dictatorship. They didn't actually live it out. And so in some ways that distance hasn't diminished it, it's only made it easier to create these as images that then become embodied. Does this make any sense? Or gets at your question?
Yeah, no, it does.
Yeah.
One just quick little follow-up on it. I was thinking too just about, one of the things that these regimes do, they so simplify kind of visual expression, they so simplify cityscapes, and that simplicity cast as, sort of the creation of order, sort of the reinsertion of a particular kind of authority. I think thinking about where and how there's desire built into that, and what it's fully mandating is kind of it's the simplicity of, or the way in which they create this simplicity makes it hard to think about that in some ways as desire for some reason. But in fact, it's written right into it. It's sort of, it's a space within which you can kind of think about that.
And it satisfies.
Yeah.
I mean, there's sectors of the population, probably still the same 40% that has consistently supported the dictatorship from 1973 to now, that same 40% of the population, which is the same percentage in the US of kind of approval. It's the same kind of 60-40 in the US. It's a bit creepy. But that for that base, these are very satisfying images. And the images of conflict. So it's the kind of aerial images of the tanks coming at the marchers. There's a lot of footage online of, tear gas canisters, but the image that focuses on the agency and activity of the police. And yes, it's being put up by people who are wanting to denounce it, but it's hard to do that without kind of creating a kind of pornographic kind of interest in the agency of those bodies. Yeah. And what we were talking about, like they came out immediately in full battle gear, and immediately they brought the tanks. There wasn't any hesitation on the part of the state, and that's one of the things that's quite remarkable. And just the levels of violence. So while we're seeing movements around the world, the level of just injury and death in Chile is really extraordinary. And these very specific kinds of violence, like aiming at people's faces, aiming the rubber bullets, are not happening everywhere. And I think it's about kind of the durability of that kind of militarized fascist culture in Chile that makes those views so satisfying.
We can probably take one more question. Is one.
Alejandra, yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. That was really thought-provoking, and I really enjoyed it, and I can't wait for your book. And sort of thinking about that, but thinking about the other side, right? So you've talked about these images that are satisfying for that, to that 40%, and that are that remind us of the dictatorship. What about the other side, right? You showed that image with the Mapuche flag, or we were talking briefly about Anatillo and like how she came out with the Cacerolazo song.
Yeah.
What about these images that are circulating widely on social media that show sort of this more empowering view of the other side?
Yeah. Yes, empowering, but also completely entangled, right? So that part of the movements which are about bring it on, that kind of feeling, are completely entangled in that dynamic. And I think this is what Patti would have us go back to in her critique of the denunciatory Funa movements, which were about, we're going to find the bad guys and we're going to expose them. So again, making them visible, right? As if then that solves the problem, is if you establish that edge, then we're safe. If we find out who the bad guys are, then we're safe, rather than asking what are the ways in which the kind of fascination with in the 1970s and 60s with the guerrilla fighter, right, and the Che Guevara figure. So in the Mexican '68 student movement, some of the media reporting would show student activists, and they said, "Oh, look at them! They're all," and they were, in this case, it was young women. They're like, "Oh, they're all going out as Che. They're all dressed up as Che." So it was this kind of very, this kind of gender ambiguous, generative figure, generative of all kinds of signification that was invested with all kinds of erotic charge by both the right and the left. And this rhetoric of militarized conflict really escalated, I think, the levels of violence that were made possible and the justification for the use of overwhelming force in situations where, as we talked about in the case of Chile and Mexico, where the guerrilla insurrections were mostly fantasy, right? And so the disproportionate, overwhelming use of force was very much related to a shared kind of erotics of violent political conflict. Yeah. And I'm not saying, and I think that, again, pacifism doesn't necessarily undo that, but participates in that struggle over what are the boundaries. Yeah, thank you for the questions. Those are great.